So first I want to talk about the initial tradition of actually feasting when you are putting someone to rest. So the actual earliest finds that we have as far as the idea of eating something while you're going through that period of memorializing someone is in the Paleolithic period, and that is of endocannibalism. So endocannibalism is when the person that's doing the eating is a close family member or a member of the tribe. We don't have written record, obviously, from the Paleolithic period, so we're not really sure why, what the rationale was behind the ritual of endocannibalism during that time period. And when you actually are practicing endocannibalism and you're eating someone that has already died, it's called mortuary cannibalism. And so, like I said, we don't understand the rationale behind that period just because we don't have enough documentation because there's not a written word. However, mortuary cannibalism is something that started in the Paleolithic, in fact, possibly before then, as kind of an practice. And so we do have excellent examples of mortuary cannibalism that actually continued not only into period, but into the 20th century. And it's something that's actually found throughout the globe. So it's not just something that's found in Europe or in any other singular area. We have examples in Papua New Guinea and Africa, as well as Central and South America with multiple tribes, one of which carried into the 1960s. And so as far as the different forms of mortuary cannibalism that would be practiced, first, there's the idea of the eating of the entire corpus or the whole body. So it would be cooked up into a meal for everyone to share. In different cultures, you wouldn't have to eat the entirety of the body, so there would be a small amount of the body that would be eaten. So some people might be familiar in period with even the eating of sacred relics or the use of sacred relics in rituals that involved consumption. So soaking a bone in broth, that was a ritual that was a relic bone of maybe a saint to give you saintly properties or to be able to have healing. In actual Europe, we also have the idea the Druids would do something a little bit different than the physical just eating of the corpus. So they actually would burn their dead, use the cremains themselves, either direct in the mouth to taste or putting it in either a liquid, so like a broth for a soup, or putting it in wine or another fermented beverage to just drink. So one of the most famous uses of physically just drinking a loved one is that of Mausolus, for who we named the mausoleum. His wife loved him so much that after he was cremated, she had the ashes put into a cup of wine and she drank the entire cup of wine, having consumed his entire body. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we don't really think about. When we talk about biblical use, the allegory of when Christ talks to his disciples and he says, yeah, you're going to eat this bread and it's totally my flesh. You're going to drink this wine. It's totally my blood. No one was like, Big J, that's pretty gross. I don't really want to do that. And no one seemed astounded when he said that this would be a practice that they would have. And it tells us that during that time period, that's something that people at least knew of cultures doing, and something that was at least somewhat like on the radar as something that could be acceptable. So also, let's talk about more biblical times as well. So thankfully, we move from the physical, actual consummation of bodies to something more figurative later. And so then you have the transubstantiation doctrine, like all of that of, you physically eat something that symbolizes the body of the person. So we actually have a story in the Bible where Enoch actually sells his birthright to his brother for a taste of a stew that his brother creates for their father's funeral and some of the bread. The stew that's described there is a stew that is made from goat. And what's interesting about this is that we have, there's a king from the 8th century that had a giant feast at his funeral. And what they did is they ate a goat stew and a number of fermented beverages. When they had completed eating the meal, the table that they ate the meal at, everything that they used to prepare the meal, including leftovers, any of the plates, any of the silverware that they used, was left in the tomb, and it was sealed. So what that did for us in the current day, well, in 1957, is it allowed us to be able to see the way in which they had eaten the food, but also have the actual food and drink there available to be able to analyze. So we believe that person to be who we call in history King Midas. And we actually have the recipe for the goat stew because it's been analyzed. And I have a recipe that I'll link for that you can create at home. And it is similar to the one that's described in the Bible, although the one in the Bible doesn't give us enough information to create a complete recipe. But it's interesting because there's that time period between the time of the Bible that we're talking about and then the 8th century, and we're still eating goat stew as part of our funerary stuff. Now, in biblical times, we do have burial sites that have flatbreads. So one of the things that they would do is they would serve a little bit of like meat, cheese, and a little bit of bread if you didn't have a whole lot of money. And they would also take food typical of what you would eat and put it with you in your burial area. So we do have examples of extant flatbreads of different types from burial sites around the biblical era. Now, let's talk a little bit about how things would work if you were a little more wealthy. Probably the most famous of all burial sites that we have in the ancient or modern world is in Egypt. So the temples and the pyramids in Egypt and the Valley of the Kings. And one of the things that's very interesting about food in this time period is even though in the Valley of the Kings, a lot of the tombs were desecrated later. People came in and took things. They didn't really care about the food or the drink. They were more worried about things that were worth money. So one of the things that is helpful for us as people that study food is that we have those extant foods and drinks, not only available to us in that they were left at the tombs themselves, and in some of the tombs that we found that were less touched, were left entirely untouched, but also everything, the funeral processions themselves, because it was part of a sign of your status, were actually carved or painted into the walls of the tombs themselves. So we can see the general types of food that would be served or would be prepared. And during that time period, there's a change from the actual feast being the eating of the corpus of the person that has died, to creating a feast for that person to take with them into the afterlife. So the food is really at that point for the person that has died. And as a bonus, if there's extra, we're going to have like a small feast with the people that are there at the end to be able to, get a little bit of the nice food that was there for the pharaoh that he's not necessarily going to take with him. So he's not going to notice if he's a couple flagons short. So we have evidence of that as well. So I have several recipes that I'll be putting up at the end of this for several different things. One of them is a bread that is actually shown on the tomb of Ramses II. And the interesting thing about it is it's a kind of a spiral shaped circular bread. And it looks a lot like a cinnamon roll, like a modern day cinnamon roll, but it's not sweetened and it doesn't have cinnamon on it, but super similar looking. And it's a form of bread. There's also another one that's more of a sweetened candy bread that is a cone shape that's from a different king. And again, it is depicted on the walls themselves. It's also found inside. One of the other things that you would take with you with food were not just sweets, although we'll see throughout the rest of the presentation that sweets are associated with things that we would want with the funeral and with death. But in addition to that, we also see high-end meat preparation. So as far as animals, like they would sacrifice animals themselves to be taken with them into the afterlife. But we also find in several burial sites a liver pate preparation. Now, liver pate was very important in Egypt and other ancient areas that were in deserts because you can't get animals that have a lot of fat on them. And so goose fat, from which liver pate is made, was an important way for you to be able to get certain vitamins and minerals that are found in the liver of those animals. So raising geese was actually something that's associated with the Jewish people. And it comes to ancient Egypt with the Jewish people coming there as slaves. And it's something that it's interesting because the Jewish people were kept as slaves and they kept their own geese, but also it becomes this big thing where the pharaohs are able to eat this rich and enriched meat product. So I also have a recipe that I'll be posting that is for the preparation for a pate from ancient Egypt as well. And then probably one of the most interesting things that I'm going to present this whole time is there's also documentation of a, get this, chocolate cake. So there is a trade route that allows chocolate as in the form of kind of the chocolate bean to be brought to Egypt. Super rare. It only comes to the pharaoh because it's very hard to get. It's very rare to be able to get it all the way over there. But there is documentation of a early proto form of cake that was flavored with chocolate in one of the tombs. So, I mean, it's telling you that they are literally taking the largest and nicest foods they can find, the absolute best finery and riches with the pharaohs and with those of high stature into the afterlife. So it's a way to show off. After ancient Egypt, we move into ancient Greece. So Greece is a little, the part of the Mediterranean that Greece is in is very scrubby. So it's hard to have big like cows in the area. So a lot of the food that they ate dealt with lamb or with goat. So there, we have our first kind of funerary specific food that comes up in ancient Greece. That's panoxyre is the name of a specific stew that they would make that was a funerary specific. You would make it when someone had died, and it would be something that would be shared. And so it is a stew that is made of goat or lamb. It's actually relatively filling. It has greens in it as well as beans. And I have a recipe for that that we'll be posting after. So you can check that one out too. Not to be underdone by Greece, ancient Rome, funerals are just like everything else in ancient Rome. It is a way for you to showcase your immense, ridiculous wealth and show off. So in ancient Rome, by that time, people were more mobile, so you were able to know more people. So we start to see the beginning of a waiting period after the physical death of the body before you have your feast day. And what that is they're allowing extended family members to be able to come to the area to be part of the bereavement feast, as well as other people that you may have known. So depending on the level of your notoriety, you're going to want richer, more well-known figures to be coming to your funeral because it's a big sign of how great you were, and it's a big sign for your family. So in ancient Rome, they would wait 7 days after your death before they would have the cena for your death. So cena means dinner. And basically it would be a community event. So if you were a relatively rich person, it would be something that your entire town would be in on. And it's something that your family is paying for. So your friends might help out, but it mainly comes as a cost on your family because it's a way for you to show the immense wealth that you had. One of the interesting things that you have that starts in ancient Rome and is actually going to carry through, as we'll see, in some places into the modern day, is the idea that in addition to being able to show your wealth with the types of food that you would have and everything else, you would actually hire people to mourn you, because the more people that mourned you and prayed for you after your death, the better things would be with the gods. So you would literally give out largesse to people that were of lower stature in class to convince them to want to pray for the bereaved soul. So like they would give out things like shoes, leather shoes, which would be something relatively expensive that someone that was poor wouldn't have a whole lot of. And the exchange for that is going to be that they're going to come and they're going to mourn for you publicly. They would have kind of a parade for your funeral procession. And so the more mourning, the more number of people that there were mourning for you, and the amount of wailing and crying and mourning that was done was a factor as far as how beloved you had been and how honorable you were. So having a big, nice feast is a great way to say that you were a big, important person and that you had a lot of wealth. So I have a couple of recipes. A lot of them are, again, going to include wine, because the Romans love wine. So we have several that are meats and a wine reduction, and different ways to do lamb. And so you'll find that with these ancient rituals that a lot of times they're serving stew. And the reason that they're doing that is because you're serving an unknown number of people that's going to be at least the extended family. So you've got a large number of people and you're really not necessarily sure how many there are going to be. So stew is a good thing where you can just add a little water if you need to and be able to expand what you've got to be able to accommodate a larger group of people than you initially expected there to be. So again, like I said, ancient Rome kind of took it over the top. And so then let's talk a little bit more about King Midas. I kind of touched on it earlier. So the person that we think of historically as King Midas with the Midas touch, the golden touch, was actually a king that lived in in the Phrygian space, which is basically Persia in the modern day. So if you've seen like a Phrygian cap, which is kind of the Smurfs hat, it's from that time period. And so Midas was a king of immense wealth, which is why there's the idea that everything that he touched turned to gold. So it's interesting in this that we have in 1957, scientists from the University of Pennsylvania actually discovered untouched the tomb of this king that we think of as King Midas. And the interesting thing about it is they had left the giant cauldrons with the stew in it. They had extra. So there's 2 cauldrons that are relatively full. And when they had the feast, they had a bunch of people come through, they ate everything, and they had leftovers. They left the entire table that they had used, like I said, all of the silverware, all of the everything. And that's really important to us as we study it in history, because at that time period, when they discovered it in 1957, we didn't necessarily have all the information that we needed on that. But also it's interesting because we have extant samples of the bread, of the fermented beverages, and of the stew that was served. So we were able to analyze those and from those create the actual recipe, which, like I've said, several different historians have actually recreated the recipe. So I have that recipe for you. Something else of interest, unfortunately, it's not currently available, but if you're familiar with Dogfish Head, they actually used the recipe from one of the brews that was found in this find, and they created a beverage, a fermented beverage that they sold called Midas Touch. It was actually really good. It's one of my favorites from theirs. So you were able to actually taste this beverage from the 8th century at a commercialized brewing operation in the United States. Isn't that crazy? So I've actually tasted it a couple times. It's something that they cycle through. So when it comes back around, definitely look for it. It's in a purple container and it has a golden fingerprint on it. And try it out. And otherwise, I will have the recipes available for different fermented beverages that were found in that find. So if you want to brew them yourself, you can do that as well. So let's talk about Vikings, because Vikings are a little interesting. Like the Romans, they're big on going big or going home. So with the Vikings, I had told you that in ancient Rome, we waited a number of days. The Vikings would wait a little bit longer. They would wait about 9 days after you died before they would have a huge shindig. And so the first day is the feast to the person that has died. And then after that, it's kind of a feast to all the memories that you have of that person. And then anyone that is going to make. Oh, I'm hearing that one of our baronial brewers also makes the King Midas brew. So when I teach this class again after the pandemic, I'm going to see if I can bring together as many of these foods as possible. So definitely be on the lookout for that in the post-plague era. But yeah, so talking about the Vikings again. So the first thing would be for the person, and then, you know, in typical Viking fashion, it would devolve into multiple days of debauchery and being drunk, you know, like you do. So one of the things that I find interesting about the Viking era is there were, again, specific foods that were used at funerary times. So one of them is a sweetened bread, which is actually very similar to what we think of as modern shortbread. And so they would serve these sweetened bread pieces, like it's not cake, it's shortbread, so it's like a cookie. So they would serve that kind of to help you sober up a little bit. And it's something that they would serve towards the end of the feasting that you would have for that funerary period. So it was something that you could take home after as well, because it keeps relatively well. So it's interesting, we'll find that that specific use of the shortbread is actually taken to all the different places that Vikings went, and it stays there. I'll touch on it again as we go through more time periods, but it's going to be something that sticks around for a while. So let's talk a little bit about the Middle Ages, something that's near and dear to most of our hearts. In the Middle Ages, funerals take on a little bit more appeal as far as there's time periods where more people are dying. So if a lord dies, they have what is called the averil, and the averil means the heir's ale. So it's a time period where you're doing two things. One, you are toasting to the lord that has died and all the good times that you may have had with the lord that's died and the respect that you have for that lord. But you're also toasting to the new heir that is being named that's going to get that title. So there's interesting things that happen at this particular juncture. So with the Averil, one of the things that they have is you drink with the dead. So the actual body of the dead in medieval ages, this is also true in ancient Rome, legally, you needed to be able to physically see that the person had died. So they have to have a public viewing of the actual corpus or the body. So in ancient Rome, you'd come to the house and the corpse would be there usually. In the Middle Ages, depending on how classy you are, it's either going to be at your house or, if you're really lucky, at the church itself, because your body's going to lie in state. During the Averil, you would have the body at the house. Now, where things get a little weird is if you were a really well-known lord, your body may have to sit at the house for 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the time of year it is. They would rub the body down with different expensive spices to help cover the smell. So that's kind of a use of food. Thankfully, we've gotten past the point where we're eating the body, which we talked about earlier, but we're using the different foods to be able to cover up the stench. So that also means that the use of flowers around the body and the use of strong smelling liquors and strong smelling foods, again, to try to help cover that smell. So one of the other interesting things that you have is the idea that there would be a cup, a chalice or a cup, a nice cup for wine, that would be either, if there was a casket employed, it would be on the casket, or if there's not a casket employed and the body is out, like on a board, it would be near the body. And what you would do is, it's a tradition of you walk up and you pour the beverage into the chalice and you drink it in close proximity to the body. Now, that may come from the tradition that we talked about of actually taking the physical ashes and drinking a portion of the body. But this is a slightly different tradition in that you're just having that drink close to the body, and you're supposed to, when you're drinking, think about the positive memories that you had with that person. But one of the things that's interesting about it is the family has to provide all that alcohol for people to drink during this whole period of time. So this is actually a time where, if you're a lord and you're really well known and there's gonna be a lot of people, not only would your family provide, but you'd also have friends that were lords that would actually donate alcohol specifically for this, because it's going to take a decent amount of alcohol that you're not necessarily going to just have on hand. So that tradition has actually carried on even into the modern era. In certain cultures, where at the time of death, like in Hispanic cultures and Irish cultures and other cultures, you still drink to remember that person, and you're thinking about the fond memories that you have. You just don't necessarily have to have the close proximity to the physical body. But there's that. Now, also during this time period, we have these sweet cakes and savory cakes that would be out and about. Again, coming from that Viking tradition. Yes, pouring one out for a friend. And so it would come from that Viking tradition of the sweetbreads that would be served at Viking funerals. So here's where things get a little interesting. So in Germany, you have the tradition of the corpse cake. So what that is you make shortbread style cakes, and you do in fact physically put them on the actual corpus or body for them to rise. And so it's essentially bringing into that like a portion. It's a more of a metaphorical eating of the body. So it brings you the closeness with that person. So again, it's hearkening back to the ancient tradition of consuming a portion of the corpus or the whole corpus, or even some of the cremains of the corpus, to have that communion with the dead. So that's kind of its own interesting thing. We also develop the concept of sin eating. So this one's really interesting. So when you have a culture where the number of sins that you have to be forgiven, if someone has passed without having the ability to confess all of their sins, what's going to happen? Are they going to automatically go to hell because of that? Well, no, we invented a new and exciting way to get around that, of course, by paying an individual to consume those sins from that dead person. And the way they're able to do that is they take a cake or a bread that is put on that person, and then in a big symbolic gesture in front of a bunch of people. So there's going to be a bunch of people watching this. That person is going to take that cake and they're going to eat it. And it's going to be relatively big because it's showing, the level of the sin. And that person is going to have to eat like a whole cake. And they are, in fact, eating the sins away. They're accepting those sins as a figurative gesture off of the dead bereaved person. And so then they're going to be able to confess that dead person's sins so that they can go to heaven. Yes. And so usually the person that's the sin eater is shunned. Like it's a person that's poor, that's using it because you also pay them money. So it's usually a person that's poor, and it's not something that people are, all raising their hand to get in there and do the sin eating. But also something that's interesting about that is the concept of sin eating, since it's a strongly Irish concept. It's a concept that actually carries into the United States and Appalachia into the 1800s. And we have documentation of that as well. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Something else about the Middle Ages as far as food and funerals. Remember when I told you about the Romans, how they would pay people to mourn them? So the paid mourner was definitely a thing in the Middle Ages. So the richer you were, the more mourners that you could afford to pay. The standard payment was you would give them, so in ancient Rome, you're giving them clothing like shoes that are really nice. In the Middle Ages, you're giving them a new robe because they're going to have to wear that new robe in your funeral procession while they're crying and wailing about you. So they're going to get a new robe. Typically, that robe is going to be black just because it's a cheap everyday color. It's the actual color of black was not associated with funerals until the 1500s. But so you're going to get this new robe, you're going to get bread, you're going to get cheese. And if the person was of particularly good stature, you may also get some coin on top of everything else. So it was another way to be able to show off your wealth. And so again, we have the funeral procession, and the bigger and the nicer and the longer and the larger physical number of people that are mourning your death, the more awesome you were. You could also pay to have the church bell rung more than once. So if you were someone of normal stature, you get one ring. But if you're someone that's rich or very important, you're going to get more than one. And it's going to be showing how awesome and powerful you are. So to this day, in Asian cultures and the Shinto religion, they actually have professional mourners and wailers. And so usually the people that are in that classification, and this is true throughout history, is going to be people that are on the poorer end of society. So it's a way to be able to share wealth with people that are poor. So it's going to be people that have infirmities or afflictions, so if they're disabled, if it's a person that their husband has died, then that person's widow can't really do a whole lot to get money. So it's a way for them to get money. Children, other people that are poor for whatever reason. So literally people that were in the lower rungs of society would decide, they would look for, 4 or 5 different funerals per year to be a mourner for. If you are exceedingly wealthy and your servant dies, it's actually your responsibility to pay for your servant. Now, they're not going to get as lavish of a funeral as they would be if it was the lord or the lady, but the servants are still going to get a funeral procession, depending on how rich their family is, still be able to be buried in the churchyard, but they're going to be further away from the church, showing their lower stature. And there is going to be a smaller feast with less opulent food. Again, because the idea of the feast is the family's going to come together for that funeral procession. And so as a thanks for being in the procession, you're going to get something. You're going to get at least bread out of the deal. So something else to talk about that's interesting that I had never thought about actually, and so I think it's kind of a fun thing, is during the pagan era, there was an idea that during the solstice times that the veil between worlds was weakened. And so there's this ability of the spirits to come and commune with the living. So we have All Souls Days, which are days where the idea is that the souls of the dead can in fact come to the living. So one of the things that was done during that period is you would have physical feasts. You would go to the churchyard and have a feast with your family members to spiritually feed their soul, their spirit in the world, so that they would be able to continue to come back. So there's this idea of the need of a physical nourishment as well as the spiritual nourishment that you're giving by remembering them, but the physical actual nourishment by having actual food. So one of the things that's interesting about that is it's a shared thing. It's something that you see in Europe, that you continue to see in strong Catholic areas. So like in Mexico, Central and South America, they have the Day of the Dead where they still bring food offerings to family members. You also see that in Asia. In Asia, there's a strong feeling that when someone dies, there's two parts of the soul. One of them physically stays in the grave, and one of them actually goes to the afterlife. The one that physically stays in the grave has a need to be able to consume. And if you're not doing things and leaving offerings for that physical part of the soul, it can become an uneasy spirit and it can haunt you. So there's the thought that you should leave offerings for the family member to be able to physically nourish. Also in other cultures during this time period, it even comes to the physicality of, it even comes to the physicality of having an actual tube that goes to the surface so that you can physically put food through the tube into the entombment of where the person is. So it is interesting to think of the idea that we are feeding the dead while also, like, you can physically eat with the dead while also feeding them. So it's kind of the opposite of the initial idea of physically eating the dead. Christmas Eve is actually on top of one of these pagan days where the region between worlds is very thin. So it's interesting because a lot of you have heard of A Christmas Carol. When I was a kid, I kind of wondered why there were ghosts at Christmas. But during the Victorian era, it was really common to tell ghost stories on specifically Christmas Eve. And the reason is there was still the strong link between the spirits and that time period. So it was a time period where your familial spirits were thought to reside in the hearth of the home. So having a big feast is a way to, again, replenish that spiritual energy for the spirit to be able to remain throughout the year and give you good luck. So it's interesting to think about that, that the idea of the All Souls Day coming into Christmas Eve, and that's why we have this big family feast, and we don't even think about it in the modern era. Something else that's interesting is when you have these All Souls feast days, creating physical constructions of foods that look like body parts. So in Malta, they have what are called dead men's bones. So they're actually cookies that are filled with a jelly on the inside. So it's kind of like marrow, and they physically shape them like bones. So it's like you're eating a physical bone. Also, when you're thinking about like in Central and South America, like sugar skulls, other manifestations of physical death, but you're eating those because you're sharing in, you're giving them as an offering to the dead to be able to nourish them spiritually and realistically, while also eating them during that time period yourself to share in that and show the circular nature of life. Speaking of, let's go back to endocannibalism for a second. Something that we do know is there are different rationales given in different parts of the world for the actual eating or partial eating of the corpus. One of the most interesting things to me was in Papua New Guinea, they actually eat the entire corpus. And the reason that they do that is a lot of the other things are to have memories or communion with the dead, or to be able to remove them of the body so they can go into the spiritual realm. Well, in Papua New Guinea, they eat the physical body of the dead to emphasize that when someone has died, what is left is merely a shell. There is no meaning to the body anymore because the soul is gone. Everything that was that person is already gone. So as a symbol of that, they actually take and cook the corpus itself to emphasize the nature of it's just a body now. So let's talk a little bit about early modern funerary stuff. It's relatively similar to the Middle Ages. In the early modern period, you have more of a classification of the sharing of sweets at funerals, I guess because of bereavement. And again, it pulls out of that Viking tradition of giving those sweetened breads. And yes, so let's go back to that really quick. So Tobias has a good point here. By eating the physical corpus of the dead, there were multiple diseases that you could in fact get. Knowing that, I told you there were several cultures that would, instead of eating the entirety of the corpus, would eat very specific and small portions of the body that were less likely to be able to lead to disease. And then there's also what we talked about earlier, where they would actually cremate the body and then use the cremains in either a stew type recipe or physically drinking it with it inside of wine. And that would lessen the ability for disease to be transmitted in that way. Obviously, if there was a plague or other thing like that, they're smart enough to not consume the body at that point, just because it's an overarching concern. Just like during times of plague in Europe and otherwise, when there's so many people dying, the funerary customs would also kind of get cut down to the point where maybe there's not a funeral at all. But it's kind of okay because God's just going to be cool with it because he was cool with making the plague. And it's just not realistic and practical to be able to have a funeral. So does anybody have any questions? I'm kind of like open at this point. We've got 20 minutes, so we can kind of talk about this openly if you guys want. I promise.
I did a little bit of studying when I was in college on cannibalistic communities. And it's been many years because I'm old, but I'm trying to remember. In one of the studies, I remember in some of the communities, the men would get first choice of the dead warriors' bodies. And they would eat the important parts like the heart and stuff like that. And the women and children were left the other parts that were left over, which were generally things like the brain and stuff like that. And so in those communities, the women and children were more likely to get any kind of prion than the men.
Yeah, I heard that.
And I'm trying to remember. I think that there was something about in some of those communities, there were actually some type of immunities built up within the female lines because of this over time, where they either weren't as susceptible to it or something.
Well, and so there's a division between revenge or exocannibalism, where you're eating, if it's a warrior from another tribe, the eating of that is exocannibalism, whereas maybe you're taking on positive characteristics from that body. So like a lot of times with exocannibalism, by eating them, you're taking on their prowess as a warrior or whatever. Okay. With the physical corpus for endocannibalism, because it's a loved one, a lot of times the things that you're taking on are positive attributes of that person, or it's to keep a part of that person with you, literally and figuratively, because you're physically consuming the body. So as I said, some of the rituals are to commune with that person in the afterlife. Some of them revolve around being able to keep a part of that person with you. And then there's the Papua New Guinea idea of, no, this is just a physical shell. There is nothing special about it. And to showcase that at its ultimate level, we can go ahead and consume the whole. So it's interesting. I think that the more interesting idea is when they move into the idea of cremation as a safer way to be able to take care of bodies, using some of those cremains and physically consuming some of the cremains. Now, there is something interesting in Europe, the modern Stonehenge group. So there's a group starting in the 1960s that starts celebrating kind of new paganism at Stonehenge. The first leader of that group died. His cremains were actually spread at Stonehenge. A child that was at that particular ceremony took some of the cremains and put it on her mouth and like licked it. And that led the other followers to do the same. So it was this kind of shocking event at the time period. And so there's actually a paper that I can link through that actually talks about linking that back to ancestral times and Druidic practices of pretty much doing the same thing. But often being able to take some of those cremains and put them in the wine, which, as I said, we have perfect evidence of that with Mausolus and his wife, where she took all of his cremains and as well as a large pearl. And because pearls, if you put them in caustic solutions, will actually burn down into like just kind of sand. And so she consumed those things to show his richness and to show that she wanted him to be a part of her forever after death. So interesting, right?
Very Mary Shelley.
I know, right? Like it's kind of its own little interesting thing. I personally was astounded. Like the reason I came across any of this is I was working with a theater group that I work with in town outside the SCA, and we were doing a Victorian era thing. And I was looking for something associated with funerals that was kind of sweet that we could pass out at this event because we were doing kind of a tea. And I found these shortbread cookies. And you know how like when you find a recipe online, they're going to have like 3 pages of stuff about, you know, how in their family this recipe was so blah, 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 scroll. Well, this one's actually interesting because she talked about the shortbread coming from the Viking era, which got me kind of thinking about the possibility. And so when we had Memento Mori as the theme for this event, I immediately was like, hey, I wonder if I could do more research on foods that were with funerals during that time period.
This was interesting.
I know. Speaking of, so in the Victorian era, so they kept shortbreads with it through all of the Middle Ages and into the Victorian era. And the Victorian era was so popular that there were different companies that made different shortbreads that were specifically marketed as funeral shortbreads. So this shortbread is going to have rosemary in it because rosemary is for remembrance. And so one of the ones I made had rosemary and stuff and came from a period recipe from that time period. And then they also had ones like where they would use the flowers from the time period that meant different things for the bereaved, and they would cook the flowers into these shortbreads. So it's really pretty. And the idea that you could either eat the shortbread or you could take it home because it keeps relatively well. You could take it home as a memento mori, and oftentimes it would be wrapped in a paper that would have like a Bible quote that was a favorite quote of the person or something like that. So that is a memento as well.
I think the Victorians were good at inventing new ways of killing themselves.
True.
Pretty much, so killing themselves,
They
and then
got
also,
used a lot.
I'm just sitting here thinking about the time that a funeral happened in my family and everyone brought a ham. Everyone.
well, and
Yeah.
it's
They started
interesting.
handing out whole hams.
Casseroles are a big thing in the South.
Correct. And so that was something, one of the other things in my family. So my stepdad is from India, but he grew up in Africa. And so in his family, there is no, like, Sikhs don't have a funerary tradition of food. Like they don't have one. You all eat together in a communal meal, but there's not like a specific food. And my mom being from the South, like casseroles are a thing, but that's it. And I took a class in grad school about American cultural foodways. So it was a food history class, which got me into the idea of food history. Well, when I took it, one of the things we talked about was what foods do you bring to funerals? And so I didn't know that there were different cultures that had very specific foods that they still bring to funerals. So like Mormons have something called funeral potatoes. That's what they are. Even when you serve them outside of a funeral, because you may serve them a different function, they're funeral potatoes. And so it's basically like kind of it's potatoes, like mashed potatoes, essentially, as we would think of them, kind of like between mash and new potatoes. So they're buttery, kind of cooked potatoes that are soft. And then they put cornflakes on top of them. But that culturally is like, you have to have that when someone dies. And if you take it to something else, because people like to eat it, it's great. But like, it is a guaranteed thing that you will have at least one batch of funeral potatoes at a Mormon funeral. Okay, I have no
I
idea.
learned the hard way that in Japan, you don't take a bowl of rice and take 2 chopsticks and jam it right down the middle and put that on the table. Not a good thing to do, unless you're at a funeral, which apparently then is a good thing to do.
I mean, it's just interesting. And the idea, like, I think it's interesting through time period to see, like, we go from the physical or metaphorical eating of the corpus to now the dead person has to have a feast to carry into the afterlife. And then we'll snack on some of it. And then we go from that to, okay, now who cares about the dead person? We're gonna have a good time.
Yeah.
Kind of what we have now.
I'm sorry, I just can't get over the pipeline for food to the dead person.
And it's in more than one culture. Like, it's great.
Yeah.
I just keep thinking about that the whole time. Like, we're just gonna have a feast, and hey, you want a little bit of this? We'll just toss
You
some
see
of
the
those
little shrines all the time with the little cups of sake, or some sort of alcohol, right? That
Mhm.
evaporates, I guess, and then I don't. Maybe that's the idea, but it gets
I don't-
refilled.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It just
Yeah.
depends on the culture, because I know, like, in some of the cultures, when you would have the saints' day, so you'd go to the churchyard and you're with your ancestors, you're eating next to their grave, and you're leaving food on the grave. Like, there's actually stuff that says, like, when a monk died, they would continue to prepare that person's food for a month. So they would still give, brother, insert whatever here, he would have his serving of food, and it would sit for the meal. And then they would donate the meal to someone that was poor, like as an alm for that monk during that time period. And then after 1 month, they don't get their rations anymore. So sorry, poor people. But for a month, it's good going.
They are where they are at that point.
Yeah. Well, and also the idea by having these professional mourners or by having these huge extravagant ceremonies that it's going to somehow, be that last little thing that's going to get them to the good place from the bad place. Or it's going to show, how generous that they were or how pious that they were, in that their family is going to do this extensive, extravagant showing. So
I've seen some pictures from somewhere in Eastern Europe, I think Bulgaria, where they have a cake that's a life-size representation of the body in the box.
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
That's also a thing. It's out of period, but physically build like a body out of food and eat that food body as like a figurative body that you're eating instead of the physical corpus that's eating before. Now, I mean, going back to something that we had as a point earlier, like when Jesus is sitting with his disciples and he says, like, yeah, eat this bread, this is totally me, and drink this wine, that's also totally me. Not a single person was like, yo, I'm not okay with that. Like, I don't want to eat your flesh. That's kind of gross. It was something that they just openly, because it was something that was practiced in different cultures in the area, that they were easily able to be like, okay, we're going to do this figuratively. I'm not having to physically eat, the Godhead. Well, at that time period, it's just a person. So it does say a lot, because if today we're at an SDA dinner and I'm like, hey, I may die soon. If I do, I really want you guys to go ahead and eat my body. And I'd really like it if you drink my blood. Like, that would be a little crazy, right? People would probably have a reaction to that wasn't, oh, it seems legit. Right? But I do find it interesting, and it's interesting that we carry that the doctrine of transubstantiation is still a thing. So like today, there's still people that accept in church, every Sunday, they're accepting the idea that they're physically eating flesh, they're physically drinking blood.
It's physically transformed. Yeah.
Exactly, because transubstantiation, it is actually his flesh and his blood. Like what you are tasting that is probably a little dry, is in fact the flesh itself. So it is interesting that as a culture we hold this, oh my God, cannibalism is such a scary thing, but there's a whole subsection of people that every Sunday believe that they are practicing a form of endocannibalism. So
No blood during
drink
prayer.
of it. Darn. Well, and also that idea of, so when you drink the blood, right, you're drinking it out of that one shared chalice, which is the same as when you would ritualistically drink, when they put the cremains in, you would share this one chalice throughout everybody. And also when you're pouring one out for your friend in the Middle Ages, everyone's drinking from the same cup. It may be different alcohol that they're pouring into it because they run out of one thing of wine, but everyone is drinking from this cup that, because it's physically near the body of the person, has this ability to help you transcend, to commune with that dead person. But again, it's a shared cup. So this weird idea of the shared cup as a way to be able to share part of that person.
I was also thinking about like the tradition of offering bones. You eat the food and then you burn the bones for the gods. And I learned recently that's where the term bonfire comes from.
Exactly, because the fire actually has the bones involved.
Yeah.
But it's interesting again there, because like what they're having when they're doing these ashes is the bone ash. So one of the things that they would do is, if you have, so when you actually cremate a person, I don't know if you guys have ever looked closely at cremains, it is not neat granulated stuff. There's chunks in there. And so being able to take those larger bits, and they would do things like make a stew that they were steeping those bones in. And there's even record of like taking supposed bones of saints, whether or not they are, who knows, but taking a relic bone from a reliquary and creating a broth with that that's supposed to have these extra healing properties during times of plague or something like that. So that in of itself is also really interesting to me, because, you know, you're physically taking part of a saint and it's going to make this special broth. And so you're drinking, you know, saint insert here broth. But hey, it's something that they completely believed in, and it's something that worked for them. So who's to say?
I grew up in the Midwest, so I had like funeral potatoes, and there are like regional recipe differences where like
Exactly.
some places they're like cornflakes. Why would you put cornflakes on top? And some places use cubed hash browns, and other places use shredded hash browns. And some use like cream of chicken soup or cream of mushroom soup and sour cream and like 2 pounds of cheese.
And
so
it's
like
a big deal if it's done wrong.
yeah,
It's the same thing with potato salad. Like there's a super ridiculous regional variance to potato salad. Like I have heard, not eaten, a potato salad that had raisins in it. What the hell is that?
White people. Sorry.
It's white.
Or Boston beans is another one
Okay.
that can get real contentious.
Well, in Texas chili.
Oh,
Well,
beans or no beans.
beans, there's no such thing as
Beans.
chili.
No,
with
I
beans.
said Texas chili.
Yeah.
Guaranteed no beans.
That is another
Beans.
dish, not
Yeah,
chili.
that is a different dish, as a matter of fact.
But I want to take this opportunity to thank Katie for her wonderful, wonderful class. Your information was brilliant and it was insightful. And I am so thankful that you took the time to teach this class to us today. And I hope I get to hear some more about it later. So you guys are awesome and you rock.
Yeah, before we start recording, I am using my research that I did for this to write a paper, and I'll also share that, which will have the actual links to the recipes themselves. So you guys can actually recreate several of these. And I'm hoping, again, post-plague time, to be able to present this class again, so you can taste some of those. So come back by and be able to taste those. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Using food to bribe people.